We look at photos, and most of the time, well, 99% of the time, these photos that we take are sentimental and have some good memories, or there might be something useful. And in today's stories, it's quite the opposite. In fact, it captures the most horrible moments. But with all that being said, let's begin. Our first story starts off with a boy named Dylan Paiwu. Dylan was a 17-year-old teenager that loved to explore, and whenever he got the chance or the opportunity to do so, he would go out into the wilderness, sometimes by himself. He would grow up in South Kona, which is a district on the Big Island, Hawaii, and this place was known for a couple of things, such as coffee, and also its location is also known for the Ironman World Championship Triathlon. Not only was this kid a lover for the outdoors, he was also an aspiring pastry chef that was hoping to go to culinary school after he graduated. He had also had two other siblings that had the same dream as him, and I also happened to go to the same school as him as well. And so on February of 2015, Dalen would get another opportunity to go hiking and exploring in Hawaii. But this time, it wasn't just some ordinary trail that most people went on. This time, there was such a big risk involved with this trail, and just him going on this trail, which in essence made this whole thing more appealing to Dalen. Now, of course, you're asking, where is this trail? What is this trail? And to answer your question, he wanted to go on this trail that was illegal, and it was called the Haiku Stairs. These stairs were also known as the Stairway to Heaven. And why? Because it was 3,900 steps steep, and it was a structure that started on the bottom of the mountain and went really high up it. This originally was used as a former US Navy communication facilities, as since it got such a height advantage, you could see the entire island from the top, not to mention that you'll get good signal from up there. And the reason why the stairs were actually illegal, because it was mainly due to the fact that it was unsafe for people to go up it, and the actual stairs were slowly collapsing, so if anyone went up there, their safety was at an all-time low. But of course, it wouldn't really stop many people from going up these stairs, and Dalen just happened to be another. An excited Dalen would tell his grandmother, who he lived with, about his amazing plan, and as you could probably expect, his grandmother would try to convince him that you shouldn't go there, because first again, it's illegal and you can get in trouble with the law, and next of all, you could get hurt, or even worse than all of that, you could die. But as you can expect from a confident 17-year-old, he was like, nah, it's not gonna happen. I'm an expert hiker, so don't worry about me. And his grandmother, when she heard this, she knew no matter what she told him, he wasn't gonna listen, because Dalen was one of them kids that whatever he put his mind to, he was gonna see it out, no matter really what the risk was or even the reward was. And so on the morning of February 27th, 2015, Dalen would pack his stuff and would check his Facebook to see his recent post that he did, which was a photo of the stairs and him announcing that he was going hiking there, which in theory was self-incriminating, but I guess he didn't care. And after he was done checking his Facebook and his posts and seeing what other people were seeing, he would give his grandmother a kiss and then he would leave the house. Once he left the house, he would catch the bus to the mountain. Now a whole day would go by and his grandmother was starting to get worried on why her grandson hasn't came back yet. And so she would wait a bit to see that, oh, maybe he's just late and he's just caught up with something else. But eventually even more time would go past and now she's just super worried. And eventually she couldn't wait. She was originally going to go out and search for herself, but she knew that that was going to take forever. So instead she would just call the police and then file a missing persons report. The police, who would quickly find out that Dalen had been in contact with some of his family members by sending them pictures of the trail. But this would go on until about 11 AM where all communication would stop, along with one final image, which here it is. Now, I don't know if you see it straight away, and I'll give you a second. If not, here is what the family would discover and would be horrified of. You can clearly see a man walking or crouching along the forest. With this new information, the police went from Dalen to get hurt or to get lost to Dalen possibly got attacked or even worse, murdered. Now remember, the trail was illegal, so you weren't expecting many people or any person on this trail. So the fact that that man was there and he kind of looked like he was trying to hide definitely raised some red flags. And of course the police would start this massive full-blown search for Dalen, and of course they would search in the area of the stairs. But no matter how far or wide they searched for Dalen, they just couldn't find him. And still to this day, he still hasn't been found and still is a mystery. Who was that man? Was this man part of the reason why Dalen went missing? Or was he just some randomer that was also breaking the law and just happened to stumble on a picture of Dalen? We don't know and we still don't know, but I would love to know your theories, so please comment down below. Midnight of June 17th, 1939, a crowd of people began to congregate outside of this building in Versailles. Versailles is a city that was located in the very famous country of France, and this overall atmosphere of the crowd was very mixed. Some people were electric and would continue to shout and would basically act like this was a party. On the other hand, some people were quite nervous and would stay quiet and would drink alcohol to keep their nerves still. But either way, no matter how the people were feeling, it was going to happen. So around about 1:30 a.m. the doors to this massive building opened up, and as the doors were opening up, the crowd could instantly see inside of the building a group of men dressed in the same uniform walking out from the building. And these men, as they were walking out, wouldn't say anything to the crowd, and the crowd, once seeing the men, would all go quiet and would actually take a step back to give these men a bit more space. And the crowd went from very loud to the point where it was so quiet all you could hear is the footsteps of the uniformed men walking. So these uniformed men would walk to the front of the building with some wood and some tools that they had brought with them, and then they would start to create a structure. And as they were creating the structure, the men that originally took a step back away from them actually took another step back inside now to see what they were making. And as they were taking a step in, they would create this semicircle around these uniformed men, and they would just watch them hammer away at the structure. And as they were watching these men build this structure, they could see that they were really good at building the structure, because to the crowd it felt like these men building this felt seamless, if that makes sense. The uniformed men just knew where to hammer, where to put a nail, they just knew everything. And so overall it gave the impression that this wasn't the first time that these men had built this structure. And to be fair, they were so quick that just in a matter of an hour and a half would go by and the structure was fully built. And so once the uniformed men were finished, they would place a basket next to the finished product and then pack their tools, grab the remaining lumber and turned around back into the building. And once out of sight, the crowd that was pretty big had turned into a massive crowd, with all these people becoming more and more restless, because now they knew that this structure was built. The next time those doors opened, the party was really going to start. And also the fact that this crowd also knew that this show was going to start pretty quickly, because they couldn't do this whole show when the sun was up. The reason was because the press would make their way and take some photos, and it was basically something that the officials didn't want. So as they're expecting at any time for this to start, the crowd would notice that this was taking ages, to the point where the crowd would get even more restless and also more drunk, because more people were waiting and drinking. I went from a quiet crowd, which was just standing and waiting, to a louder and then a louder and then a louder crowd. And as more men began to get more drunk, they began to get more disruptive. And around 4:45 a.m, when the sun had finally came up, the press in full force came out just like an army, with their cameras trained at the door of this building. So seeing this, the crowd actually began to get a bit disheartened, because they knew that since the press is here, this event was most likely not going to happen. Now with some men seeing the situation would begin to start heading back home. And as these men who were starting to make their way back home, one man would shout, "Stop, someone's coming." So everyone would go silent and they could hear footsteps coming from the big building, and eventually the doors would swing open. And standing on the left and the right were two guards, and in the middle was a 31-year-old man named Eugene Wieldman, who had his arms tied behind his back, and the collar of his white shirt had been tucked down because his neck needed to be free and clear. And the reason because of that, I'm sorry for saying because so much, but he was going to be beheaded. And the reason because he was going to get beheaded was because Eugene was a serial killer and he had been convicted. And of course, killing someone in these times was punishable by death. And so that was his punishment. So the two guards that were on his side would pull him forward and would pull him out into the crowd. And the executioner that was behind him, who was wearing a full blackout outfit, took up a position next to the wooden structure, which, by the way, if you haven't guessed, it's a guillotine. And so as Eugene is getting brought out to the crowd and everything is getting set up for his execution, the crowd went completely wild. They were shrieking, they were howling, they were just laughing and pointing at Eugene and booing at him, and just basically become hysterical and bloodthirsty. And Eugene, as you could probably guess, was just looking down and didn't want to look up, and would just keep his head down, not daring to make eye contact with anyone that was in the crowd. So eventually, after kind of showing him off, the two guards would march him towards the guillotine. And at this point, the executioner was ready and had taken up his position next to the guillotine. They would grab him, they would slide him forward, so he was on his stomach on top of this wooden platform, aka the guillotine. And so they slid him forward all the way until his head was poking through the open at the very far end, and at which point his neck was completely placed under this massive huge blade that was dangling above him, and his head was positioned right above the metal bucket, which was on the ground and what he was staring into. And at that point the crowd had got to the peak of their loudness and their craziness, as the executioner would pull the lever down and the blade came soaring down and would remove the head of Eugene, and the head would fall into the bucket that was placed underneath him. And once that was done, the executioner put his torso into the basket that was placed out earlier, and then the executioner and the prison guards gathered up the remaining of Eugene's body parts and they went straight back into the building, which was a prison. And at this point the crowd hasn't stopped cheering and still basically going wild, and they now ran up to Eugene's blood, which was scattered on the floor, and would begin to dab their scarves and their handkerchiefs in Eugene's blood, which again was all over the floor and was acting like a souvenir for the inmates that shows that they were there for his execution. Now of course, since the sun was out and this entire event happened during the light and also had been caught on film, and so a day later and for over the next couple of days, the headlines all over France was about this bloodthirsty crowd that was cheering on a man being beheaded. And this whole event and this whole article just made the nation of France look extremely bad. So the French leaders decided that from that point onwards they could no longer have any public executions, so the guillotine would be continued for the next couple of decades, but beyond that it was all behind closed doors. Here's some more notable pictures that the media used from Eugene Wheelsman's execution. The year is 1970 and a 14-year-old boy named Keith Sapford was currently living in Sydney, Australia with his parents. Now his life was good. He had an amazing education, he had amazing parents, he had food on the table, he literally had everything that a kid could possibly ask for. But for him, yes, he was grateful to his parents for allowing him to have such a luxurious life. But there was something that he wanted to do which his parents wouldn't allow him to do, mainly because of the fact that he was so young and it costed a lot of money, which of course the parents didn't have. And what was that dream or kind of ambition? It was to travel the world. Now don't get me wrong, his parents were in full support of him trying to travel the world, but again, him or them not having enough money was a big problem. And again, since he was so young, he wouldn't even have money to save. But some time would pass and the parents of Keith would manage to save up a little bit of cash, and the three of them did go on a nice European vacation. His parents would muster up this money somehow to not only let their boy to kind of live this dream, but to also calm his desires of traveling down, at least hopefully a little bit anyways. But once they got back home from their vacation, it was kind of the opposite effect. Keith, now having experienced this life that he had so long dreamed for, to now going back home and losing this dream life, made him more desperate to live this life. Now following this vacation, the parents of Keith would find themselves chasing after Keith on a daily because Keith was trying to run away. And again, Keith had nothing against his parents, but when he saw that living with them wasn't going to lead to him living his dream life and to explore the world, he decided that he needed to leave. But every time he would run away, his parents would quickly find him and would bring him back home. And of course, as the son got older and older, the harder it would get to find him, and in turn it would be longer and longer he would stay outside missing. And his parents are thinking that there's going to be a time where he's going to go missing again, but this time get really hurt. So in order to kind of save their child, they would enroll him to a very strict boarding school that was for boys like Keith who had behavioral problems. And while they were hoping that the staff in this school was going to be able to calm down their son and keep him away from essentially running away all the time. But just like their plan with the vacation, it kind of had the opposite effect. Mainly the fact that this school was kind of like a prison and you weren't allowed to leave whatsoever. So quickly when Keith got himself into this school, he would try to find ways to get out and to escape this boarding school. And just after 2 weeks of arriving at the school, he would be successful and would elude the staff. It would be 3 days after he had escaped this boarding school where he found himself at Sydney Airport. I remember this is the 1970s, so it was far easier to get into an airport than it would be today. And because of this, it was mainly the fact that there wasn't a lot of security. Well, of course now if you go into an airport, there's security everywhere. And since there wasn't much of that, Keith would find himself in the airport. So Keith would arrive and walk across the tarmac to a plane that was bound for Tokyo. Then he climbed inside the wheel well and tucked himself in there, waiting for a takeoff. A photographer named John Glippen happened to be at Sydney Airport on the same day that Keith decided to sneak into a wheel well in an aeroplane. He had went there because he had just bought a new lens for his camera, and so he wanted to test it out by taking pictures of planes. And at one point he was taking pictures of the tarmac, and then he began to take pictures of the plane that was taken off. And as he was taking pictures of the plane, he felt like these pictures were going to be really good. And so once the plane fully took off and was out of sight of John would take a couple of more pictures before putting his camera away and then leaving the airport. And for some reason he didn't really think twice about the pictures that he took. In fact, somehow he kind of forgot about them until a week later. John was looking through the photos that he took that day, and he was scrolling through them until he got to one picture that once he saw it, he froze, because John had accidentally captured the final moments of Keith as he fell nearly 200 feet to his death. The plane that was taken off and John was deciding to take pictures of was the same plane that Keith had entered the wheel well in. And as soon as the pilot took off, the wheels retracted, opening that wheel well for a brief second, and there was nothing for Keith to hold on to, and so unfortunately he would slip out. But even if he hadn't fallen out from that wheel well, he would certainly almost die to freezing temperatures and the lack of oxygen at that altitude. And so here is the final image of Keith before he fell 200 feet to his death. So that'll be it for today's video. Comment below if you like these type of videos, and I'll make sure to respond to all of them. But with all that being said, if true crime stories intrigue your interest, then I would highly suggest you subscribe to my YouTube channel, as that's all I do and I upload once a week. But with all that being said, I thank you for watching, and yeah, goodbye.